Okay, so here we've arrived at the Sicilian. Now, before I begin talking about anything else, I think it might be interesting to just kind of give a note on what exactly this Sicilian might be referring to. So in music, generally speaking, when you hear the term Sicilian, it tends to get associated with the so-called, Sicilian rhythm, which refers to this kind of, long, short, long, is kind of a lilting feeling of a rhythm. So obviously you just heard that there in this section. And I think that's mostly basically, how that gets tied into this piece. Now, of course, you might have noticed that you got a wildly different middle section. And that now, so we get to talk about something really interesting, which is in the sketch, it is not titled as Sicilianisch, but instead called Zwei Sicilianisch, which translates to as, two Sicilians. And in fact, these two, which are now, of course, like over here, these two different sections are kind of meshed into one piece, right? But over here in the sketch, these are actually two separate parts, so it's kind of two separate pieces that he just eventually in the fair copy made the decision to mesh together. So I think this is actually pretty, in some ways it's kind of characteristic of what Schumann usually does with his other pieces as well. Maybe if you've heard some of his other piano works, you might notice that he tends to put really, really different sections together. So like in one section he's like lyrical and it's gushing, and then suddenly in the next section it's ballistic, it's going everywhere. And I think this is actually a pretty great example of that. But since he made the decision to put these two together, I believe that he wanted to maybe kind of maximize some sort of a factor in difference, or some sort of shock factor maybe even, because he wanted these two, despite being in one piece, to have the two sections kind of sound as differently as possible. And I think with that, we perhaps get a little bit of a privilege, because he doesn't put any sort of a differing tempo indication or any, even like a different musical indication for that second part. But I feel like with the type of person he was, with the type of pieces he composed, with the stuff that he did in general, we maybe have the privilege to add a pinch of speed to that second part to help, kind of create a even more contrasting character. And obviously, while he didn't put anything in specifically, his wife Clara, in her edition, added a tempo indication for this part, which wrote schnell. So directly translated, that means fast. And actually, in her edition, she also included, there was also an Italian translation added below it, which indicated presto. Now, I'm not aware whether that presto is actually translated by her herself, or whether that's some sort of later on addition. But just the schnell itself gives some sort of indication as to what is possible. Now, just a quick disclaimer here. Clara is not known to be a particularly reliable editor, despite the fact that she's Robert Schumann's wife. There are accounts that she's not particularly reliable with this editing stuff. But like, even if it's cherry picking, I still believe that it's a nice addition. And even if you don't want to, change the speed in the end, it does give a little bit of an indication as to what you might be able to do. So, that leaves a little bit of a crunchy option for any of you guys who are interested in that. All right, now back to the differences between these scores. Besides the main and glaring one, which is that, the two sections were separated originally in the sketch, first talk about some of the really, really big differences. You can see in the middle section that, although it was also indicated as 2/4 in the sketch, instead of being 16th notes, he actually used 8th notes. So even despite a speed increase, it would have been something more like. So I feel like that might kind of be an entirely different character. And also, he has these, he has the material repeated kind of in 3 different blocks. So there's one which is, so that gets played twice, and then that also gets played twice. And then, obviously, in the fair copy, in the final published version, we get one more repetition of before returning to the more melancholy initial opening section. He just doesn't have that last repetition here in the sketch version. Maybe he didn't want it originally, maybe he forgot to include it. But regardless, I think it's nice to have it just one more time so we get a bit more of a kind of final closing feel, I guess, for that section. Okay. And in any other case, if we return to the kind of the A section, the initial section over here, there are still a couple more differences. For example, it's kind of spotty. It's not exactly easy to read, but so again, it's not super clear, but it appears that he originally had quite a few more extra notes, so to speak, that he didn't have in the fair copy, in the published version. And what I suspect is that he might have thought, since the middle section is going to be kind of a more, you could say busy, you could say active, whatever, but maybe to maximize the kind of sense of contrast between the first part, which is kind of a more, I would say, simple part, versus the middle part, which is more complex. Maybe he decided that, having so many additional notes in the left hand might kind of cause the initial section to become more bloated than he wanted it to be. So eventually he kind of streamlined it down into the sweet and simple version that we have today. But yeah, I do enjoy the changes. I think I like them more than the original version.